Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Barry, it's a pleasure to have you back. We got a new microphone set up, so there'll be no problems this time. How's it been, man?
Hey, it's been real, man. It's been real.
You know, I got a lot of questions for you. We were talking
Yeah.
like for 30 minutes off air, basically, but I gotta know more because last time I thought you did a really good job breaking it all down. What I thought was important was you left the log out, so anybody can listen to it, and I listened to it over and over and over again, and you can stop at certain moments, and then you can start to look up what you're saying and be able to find the information out for yourself. But due to some recent scheduling things of people I'm going to be having on, I started doing a deep dive into these documents, and I went into the Trafficante to the Giancana parts that I kind of avoided in the beginning. And I'm starting to try and understand who these figures were. So when it comes to the introduction of the mob or organized crime in a sense of this relationship working together, could you explain a little bit about that? Explain maybe a little bit about who Trafficante was, at least his importance as well, and then his relation into the assassination.
Yeah, it's really important to understand the genesis of this relationship between the mafia and our United States government, because that explains what happens later in Cuba with Trafficante and everything that we discussed earlier. This goes back during World War II, 1943, when the Allies has just defeated the Germans and the Italians in North Africa. And so the next target's going to be Sicily. And we know it's going to be a tough landing in Sicily, and then from there to Italy, up the boot of Italy, across the Alps and Switzerland and Austria, and then into Germany. That's the point. We know it's going to be a tough landing. The Germans aren't going to let us just land. And so we had a Lucky Luciano was a mobster up in New York. He was rotting away in a jail cell up in upstate New York. And Thomas Dewey, who's fixing to run for president, is the guy who put him in jail. He was the district attorney, the prosecuting attorney for the state of New York. And he decides to make a deal with Lucky Luciano to help the Allied forces land in Sicily. So he offers him release from jail. The guy's going to be in there for the rest of his life, potentially. So he knows he'll be open to this deal. He says, in exchange for your release, we're asking three things out of you. First, you go home to Italy. You can't stay here in America. And when you go home to Italy, you get all your mafia family members and all your people to help us behind enemy lines as saboteurs and as spies to help us land in Sicily and then eventually Italy. That's first. Secondly, we're having a problem on the New York City docks. We've been infiltrated by Nazis. We've been infiltrated by communists. We need somebody who will blend, and your people do that better than our people do, with these dock workers and root out all of these people, these communists and mainly these Nazis, who are sabotaging our efforts to supply the war effort from the New York City docks. And so that's second. And thirdly, after the war, we are going to be running drugs out of the Golden Triangle through France and into Cuba and eventually into the United States, the inner cities. And we want your people to help make that possible. And so in exchange for those three things, Lucky Luciano was released from prison. He went back to Italy. And if you study your history, you know that the landing on Sicily went about as well as could be expected. We got there and the Germans were gone. And then we got to the southern tip of Italy and worked our way up the boot, and everything was going great. We had great help from the locals. The saboteurs were doing their job. The spies were doing their job. Lucky Luciano came through, for the United States in World War II and helped us. Now, we didn't end up going into Germany from Italy because we ran into the Alps, and that's where Mussolini and Hitler made their stand. But it did help us land in Sicily and take Italy for the most part, and then buy time before Normandy. But that was a successful venture where the mafia, Lucky Luciano and his people, came through for the United States government. He also cleaned up the docks. Now, there's some great movies on this. They could use means that the U.S. government could never use, and I mean torture. They would suspect somebody was a Nazi infiltrator, and they would take him to a steel mill, and they would threaten to throw him in one of these smelting furnaces, which is blazing hot, unless he squealed on all his partners and stuff. And that's how the mafia found out all the people that were working in the New York City docks, infiltrating the labor unions, infiltrating the dock workers, and sabotaging the United States efforts. So in two ways, they were extremely successful. So this relationship between the government and the mafia goes back to World War II. But where we get involved and where it becomes interesting to our story is the Cuba thing, because the mafia had a relationship that they helped facilitate between our government and the Cuban government. They were sort of the middle people, and they put the two together between the United States government and Batista. And Batista got rich because we basically gave him kickbacks to turn aside and allow drugs to be run through, like I said, from the Golden Triangle, which is mainly Vietnam, Laos, those Southeast Asian countries, into France, into Cuba, and eventually into the United States. It's called the French Connection. And that made Batista rich, and it made Cuba the sort of like the last stop before all those drugs made it into the United States. And this is how the CIA, after World War II, financed a lot of its covert ops. This is black money. It's unaccounted for. Nobody knows where it's coming from. Nobody knows where it's going. And this is one of the reasons why in '59, when Castro comes in and overthrows Batista, it angers not just the mafia, it angers the United States government, the CIA, and all the people that were getting rich off this Cuban drug running operation that Batista had allowed to go on for years. At the time that Castro came in and overthrew Batista, he said Cuba is for Cubans. And he made it known, I'm kicking out all the Americans. I'm going to nationalize all the industries, the legitimate ones, like the mines, the minerals, the utilities, the sugar plantations. I'm going to nationalize all that. In other words, I'm stealing it from the Americans. It's now going to belong to us again. And I'm shutting down all the mafia casinos. I'm shutting down all of the brothels and the hotels and all that, all the stuff that the mafia was involved in. And I'm kicking out all the mafiosos, and this whole drug running operation, it's coming to an end too. So you have a lot of angry people in America, and not just America, around the world, that Fidel Castro has tied off something that has been very lucrative to a lot of people for a long time. One of those mafiosos that got kicked out of Cuba was Santos Trafficante. He was the Don of the Cuban mob. He was the guy who the drugs were coming through. He had facilitated the relationship with Batista. And because he had this relationship with Batista, Castro viewed him as an enemy because Batista was his enemy. So he kicked Santos Trafficante. He actually put him in jail. And there's a long story about how Jack Ruby and others went down and got him out and brought him to America and set up shop down in Florida. And that became his new territory. But it was always with the intent that he was going to get back to Cuba. That was his home place. And all those refugees that came with him were his people. And they flooded into Miami and southern Florida. And so he brought with him basically a ready-made army. A lot of people don't realize this. This ready-made army, all these Cuban revolutionaries that were so hot to get back into Cuba, extremely motivated. These were freedom fighters. They had experience fighting in the jungles. They were just tough people. And that was his ready-made army that became part of the holy trinity between the mafia, the CIA, and the Cubans to get back into Cuba and overthrow Castro and sort of reconstitute all of this money enterprise that they'd had going for all these years. So that's how Santos got to America. He was basically kicked out, or he had to flee for his life along with all these refugees, but he never intended Tampa or Florida to be his new home. He wanted to go back. And so from the very get-go, he was aiming to overthrow or kill Castro so he could go home. So when the CIA comes to him with these ideas about an S-Force and about Operation 40 and Mongoose, he was hot to trot for that idea. He just didn't want to be the one left hanging out in the wind if it went bad, which is why he was smart. Santos Trafficante, above all, was a survivor. And when you go forward, we get into the Giancana stuff. It is Trafficante who ends up being the guy who has to take out the garbage, so to speak, when it comes to mafia business, because he ends up being the guy that is the survivor of all these mafia dons. He lives the longest. He takes care of people that are talking. He orders the hits. He sort of rises and becomes the top guy.
Do you think that he killed Giancana, and do you think he killed Roselli?
I think he killed both. And I think there's FBI wiretaps to prove it.
I got a document that talked about both the deaths of Giancana and Roselli. Roselli being chopped up in a barrel, and then Giancana being shot. And they all suspect that it was Trafficante. But there's this blowback theory. I don't know if you ever heard about the blowback theory. And I have to ask the question of, when we talk about Trafficante, who was the person that made the connections with the CIA and Trafficante? Was that Roselli, or was that somebody else? Because I don't see the CIA reaching out to a Don or this powerful figure in such a way just right off the back. They have to go through a middleman.
Yeah, I don't know I wouldn't be able to tell you a name. I do know Roselli acted as a middleman with Giancana, and then Giancana, and if you remember the S-Force story, they went to Trafficante. So it was almost like an equal to an equal. Roselli went to Giancana, proposed the idea, then Giancana went to Trafficante and proposed the idea. So in that case, it was Giancana who did it, but it was through Roselli's efforts. As far as before that, when you get into Operation 40, there was a relationship there between the CIA and Trafficante that goes back when Nixon was president. Now, Nixon's best friend was, I'm sorry, when Nixon was vice president. Nixon was best friends with a Florida mobster named Bebo Rebozo. Now, I'm not saying that it was Bebo Rebozo who was the middleman, but on the very night that the Watergate burglars were arrested, Nixon had to fly back from Miami because he was vacationing at Bebo Rebozo's place. And so they were that close. So any contact that Nixon, as vice president and head of the 5412 committee, wanted to have with Trafficante could have happened easily through Rebozo. You remember Nixon also called Howard Hughes and used him as a conduit of information. Howard Hughes went through Mayhew, Mayhew went through Roselli, Roselli went through Giancana, and Giancana went to Trafficante. So I agree with you. I don't think you would ever have a deal where Nixon and Trafficante would sit down in the same room and have a conversation. But I know for a fact Nixon had Bebo Rebozo as one of his, and Bebo Rebozo is like a Roselli. He was one of these guys that could float back and forth. And so people would meet with these middle folks, and then the communication would go on further down the line. But I would guess it would be Bebo Rebozo. That would be my guess.
Now, did this all boil down from the Las Vegas incident, or did they meet up in Las Vegas? I've seen the Las Vegas wiretap, but I'm wondering, Roselli, I've heard, made connections with the CIA and a couple of people at that point in Vegas. And I'm wondering if it's over that situation with a wiretap. And I also have questions on Giancana. He was in charge of the one about putting poison powder pills in Castro's stuff and using Sidney Gottlieb to make some type of medication to make his beard fall out, thinking that they could assassinate his character in a sense. So I'm like, he's got a lot of wits for whoever he is. And a lot of it smells of intelligence operative aspects of things. I mean, the way he's designing plans is not a mobster type thing, or we just, kidnap him and we shoot him into a river or something like that. This is like, we're going to assassinate his character, which I feel like he had to be getting info from some type of intelligence operative. And I'm not trying to, broaden out research aspect, but I'm coming across documents that are talking about Mayhew and Giancana that are devising these plans in the assassination of Castro, but a lot of them are very sophisticated that I just don't see these mobster type figures doing without a little bit of help.
Yeah, and that's I when the House Select Committee pinned all the blame of the assassination on the mafia, I found it laughable. Laughable. I mean, it's preposterous. The mafia is good at hits, but they can't do all these other things, all the logistics that went into making the assassination happen. They can't do it. They don't have the power. They don't have the connections. This is why I started off by telling the story about how the mafia and the government came together. And then you add the Cubans into the mix, and they are like, they form a trinity. They're indistinguishable one from another. And this is why when you start getting into Giancana and some of the plots to kill Castro and all this, they are sophisticated because they're coming from the CIA, but the CIA gives the mob its part of the mission. And of course, the mob uses the Cubans because the Cubans can infiltrate into Cuba as their part of the mission. But the CIA is over this whole thing. They're over every plot that you want to discuss during this time period. They had their fingers in it. They just had their soldiers, and their soldiers were mafia. And of course, the mafia soldiers were Cubans. So they're interchangeable parts.
Do you mind if I show you something real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I know I sent you a couple of things yesterday because, like I said, I mean, dude, if you're drinking a little bit of moonshine and you're looking through government documents, it's a great time. But I came across this interesting thing right here where it says during the initial stages of phase one, Edwards is assigned the specific task of locating the proper persons to assassinate Castro. Chief of Operational Support Division of the Office of Security, both men agreed that I can't really read that, but should contact Robert A. Mayhew, whom the CIA had previously used in several covert operations to recruit necessary personnel. Mayhew subsequently contacted Roselli, who in turn contacted two personnel initially known operational suggest Chief Sam Gold and Joe. Says he, along with Mayhew, later discovered the true identification of these persons to be Sam Giancana and Santo Trafficante, respectively. After meeting several times in Miami and deciding upon poison pills as the method of assassination, the 1967 IG reported that Trafficante made the arrangements for the assassination of Castro, which one of his contacts inside Cuba on one of the trips he allegedly made to Havana, Cuba. This contact was Cuban official who held a position close to Castro. The 1967 IG report then states that Roselli passed the pills to Trafficante. Roselli subsequently told O'Connell that the pills were delivered in Cuba, apparently retained the pills for a few weeks and then returned them since he was unable to fulfill his plan, no longer in a position to kill Castro because he had lost his Cuban post. So, I mean, there's just a lot of stuff with like
Go back, Robbie, go back to that first page you showed me. That very first page, right when you started reading. Look at the name that starts this whole thing.
The attempt of the United States. This one right here.
Where did you start reading?
Oh, where did I start reading?
Yeah.
I start right here. The CIA.
Okay, look at.
It was.
I'm looking for the. All right, right there, second paragraph. During the initial stages of phase one, Edwards. Now, who is Edwards? Edwards is Sheffield Edwards. Sheffield Edwards was the chief of security for the CIA. So Edwards is sort of, according to this document, is sort of it says that he's assigning the specific task of locating the proper persons to assassinate Castro. And so he goes and he meets with Sam Giancana and Santos Trafficante. I told you about that meeting.
Well, he met with Robert A. Mayhew.
Well, first,
Yeah, and
yeah.
then that's when Roselli came into the picture, because I guess Edwards contacted Mayhew. Mayhew got Roselli, and Roselli was the one that got together Sam Gold and Joe, who were later identified to be Sam Giancana and Sandro Trafficante.
So if you remember the story I told you, it was Nixon, once he knew he was going to be the presumptive nominee, picked up the phone and called Howard Hughes. Okay, that's the story that Santos Trafficante tells, that's where it came from. But according to this document, Edwards said he met with Mayhew. Whichever one it came from, Nixon or Edwards, it's interchangeable. It means it's hardly distinguishable, the difference, because when Santos Trafficante, they're meeting down in Fontainebleau in Miami, says, hey, I want to know that this is from Nixon. I want to know that this is coming from Nixon. I don't want to know that this is coming from Giancana and Roselli and Mayhew and Howard Hughes. I want cover. So who did Nixon send to the meeting, the next meeting? He sent Sheffield Edwards down there. And that was confirmation to Santos Trafficante that this was coming from Nixon. So whenever you see Edwards, you know that Nixon is sending him. Or if you see Nixon, you know that Edwards knows about it. And the two are interchangeable.
But you had 635 or 600 whatever assassination attempts on Castro, and none of them worked. That makes you think that either the mafia wasn't trying to assassinate Castro, in that document you just read that they tried to assassinate a close personnel, or he was getting inside information. And what I think, and this is kind of part of the blowback theory that is in these documents, which they really didn't rule out. They looked at Giancana being killed and Roselli being killed as Trafficante kind of wrapping up the loose ends. And the reason why is there's this document I have right here. If you just give me 1 second, I'll be able to pull it up. It talked about the tremendous blackmail that basically these guys have over the United States government right now. And you'll see that right here. It says the actions, let me know when you can see it. It says the actions of Mayhew and Giancana, and particularly Roselli, in the years following these plots support this theory. As related in Section 2, these individuals actually did use their CIA affiliation and knowledge of the plots in attempts to hinder law enforcement prosecutions and objectives. The success of some of their efforts verifies the tremendous blackmail potential they possessed. As Sam Popich, the FBI liaison to the CIA, commented in May 1967, Giancana and Roselli have the CIA over a barrel. Because of that operation, he doubted that the FBI would be able to do anything about either Giancana or Roselli because of their previous activities with the CIA. Now, what I say about this is Trafficante killing both of them. The CIA telling Trafficante he needs to wrap up his loose ends. He wraps up those loose ends, not only in a benefit of the CIA, but a benefit of himself as well, too, because I do believe that, which this talks about here, if Trafficante was a double agent working for the CIA, but actually supplying information on Castro, then another scenario emerges. It is then logical to assume that Castro knew of the AMLASH and CIA organized crime operations from their inceptions. As mentioned earlier in this material, Trafficante could have received a sanctuary and assistance in smuggling contraband for such information. As also discussed earlier, however, the committee believes that even if Castro had knowledge of CIA sponsorship of plots against his life, this would not have provoked him to kill President Kennedy. Now, there is a large amount of documentation that is being so clear in an aspect of Castro did not do these. Now, I agree with that on a simple aspect of, I feel like you would be raining down hellfire on yourself if you, as Castro, tried to assassinate Kennedy. But if you had mob relations get linked back to it, and that's when I come across all these HCA investigations, and everyone says the HSA was compromised, but I see Blakey's letters to the CIA and the CIA saying, hey, you got to be careful where you step. I mean, there's documentation of them trying their best to muscle down Blakey, and he gave up room, but also took some. And in the area he was taking was this mafia angle, where I think if the mafia is involved on the CIA and the Castro sides, different individuals, sure, but mafia connections, same ones that are used for the CIA. And, you end up Trafficante being a double agent or something, maybe a better deal with Castro, being allowed back into Cuba, being able to run your activities and maybe split it a certain direction, 60-40, I would say probably with Castro would get the 60 and you would get the 40, but at least you get to go back to your home. You don't have to be in the States any longer. That's a sweet deal for Trafficante. But then there's this issue where if the mafia was then converted to bite the original head of the snake, which will be the US government by assassinating John F. Kennedy, we have to make sure that there is no mob connection. So it's in our both best interest that Castro doesn't get blamed for the assassination, and neither does the American government, because we're both in dirty deeds. Hence the blackmail operation that could be happening with Sam Giancana, which is why they had to be wrapped. I bring this up because it was weird to me to see Blakey's overall reach for this mafia plot, requesting files on Cuba. They said, you don't have permission. This is classified information. Well, make it unclassified is what I'm reading in these documents, where I'm going, this isn't the guy that I've been explained by every other JFK researcher as being a plant or a spy, or he sabotaged the committee. No, he's giving up ground and then taking some. But in respects, I did come across a lot of things with Blakey that weren't right and that should have been corrected. And other people in his HSCA committee were also saying that we're not right. But I'm getting into this point of the mob being used as an essential tool here, where it was attacking one side and also attacking the other, and it was being manipulated by Castro and the U.S. government. And the U.S. government saw it in its best interest to keep all of this quiet, which didn't come out into the Watergate hearings, but a lot of that time was spent focused on MK Ultra, which thank God it was, because Jesus, we don't have any documentation on that. But there was a lot of weird scenarios that were going on, which kind of point blame not only at Castro, but also point blame at the U.S. government. I don't think Castro assassinated Kennedy. I think it was the military, but I think the military doesn't want to release a lot of files because of this connection with the mob and a lot of this aspects, which would lead back into them biting them in the ass. I mean, there was no way the mob could have been prepped to going to Cuba, trying to plan all these assassination attempts, had the resources to be able to do so. Well, the CIA was playing God. They were adding things in certain situations that would give them the tools to go. They were nudging them in the right direction to do whatever they wanted to get rid of Castro. And I feel like Castro probably did the same. I mean, an exploding seashell, man, that's fucking nuts. And the mob's not coming up with that. That's like out of a kid's horror dream or something. That's a CIA plot right there.
Oh, that's like what you see in the old James Bond movies, where the guy is in the research lab coming up with new weapons to give his James Bond. Remember, he had the pens and he had all. Yeah, that's coming out of a lab somewhere. But I wanted to focus on a point you made, and that was 643 attempts on Castro's life. And, the mob's known for being good at what they do, and that's conducting hits. Well, that doesn't speak very well of the mob if they try 643 times and they fail. If that's their calling card, they deliberately slow played the assassination of Castro because it all centered around the election of 60. And if you remember that story, Nixon wanted it speeded up so that Castro would be dead before the election so he could get credit. And the mob begins, they make this deal. Giancana makes this deal with Joe Kennedy to help JFK win the primaries in West Virginia and then the general election in Illinois. It was going to come down to Illinois. That was going to be the state. And the mob came through in both cases and helped JFK win. Well, during this entire time, you got the Giancana family up in Chicago. You got the Trafficante family down in Florida. You've got the Carlos Marcello family down in New Orleans. And then Jimmy Hoffa's in the mix as well. And they don't want JFK to be president. Marcello has been deported by Bobby Kennedy. He had to sneak back into the country. He views the JFK as an enemy. Jimmy Hoffa is being chased around all over the country by Bobby Kennedy. He doesn't want JFK to be president. But they make a deal and they allow Giancana's deal to be the one that they're all going to support as organized crime. This is what organized crime does. It's business. What's best for business? And the Kennedy brothers have been a nemesis to organized crime with the McClellan Committee in the Senate, humiliating these mafiosos, subpoenaing them, or having them come to Washington and testify in open hearings. Giancana, Marcello, they're pleading the fifth. Bobby's threatening to put him in jail for contempt of court. I mean, it's become a real problem. And so they decide, if we help get the Kennedys elected, by promoting them to the White House, they will no longer be a problem for us in this congressional committee. The problem goes away. They got promoted, and now they'll have bigger concerns on their plate, and our problems with Congress go away. Furthermore, part of the deal was we'll have this friend in the White House, but he's also going to overthrow Castro. So we'll get back into Cuba. So they're thinking, we'll have two. Now with Nixon, we have a friend in the White House. This has always been the question. Why would the mob support JFK over Nixon when Nixon was their guy? Well, with Nixon, they didn't have a problem with Congress or they would still have the problem with Congress. If Nixon wins, the Kennedys are still in the Senate raising hell to the McClellan committees. But if Kennedy wins, he's no longer, nor is his brother Bobby, in the McClellan committees raising that kind of hell. So by promoting Kennedy, they took away the McClellan committee and the congressional oversight, and they thought, hey, we're free. We're going to get back into Cuba and we don't have to worry about Congress anymore. With Nixon, they would still have to worry about Congress, but they would get back into Cuba. So one gives them one, the other gives them two. So they support Kennedy. But the problem was nobody gave Bobby the memo. And so when he gets in as Attorney General, he continues to go after. In fact, he doubles down on his efforts to go after the mob. And this made things untenable for Sam Giancana. His word was on the line. And when Santos Trafficante and Carlos Marcello and Jimmy Hoffa deferred to Giancana during the campaign, in spite of the fact that they couldn't stand JFK, they deferred to Giancana based on the promise that Giancana made. Hey, I've got this deal with Joe, and we're not going to have any problems. Well, after the election, the problems only got worse. And then after Bay of Pigs, when he failed in his efforts to overthrow Castro, and then as time went on, he starts to back channel with Castro and make nice with Castro, they realized they'd been double crossed. They didn't get anything. They didn't get the friend in the White House they thought they were going to get, and they didn't get rid of Castro. And so this plot, and the CIA was behind all this as well, because you remember, they have just as much motive to want Castro gone as the mafia does. And that relationship that had been started back in 59 when Castro overthrew Batista, by 63 was a continuing relationship. It was something that had been ongoing for 4 years now. And so when they have that meeting in early 60 down at the hotel there, and they give them the poison pills and all this kind of stuff, this is right before the election. Nixon thinks, okay, this means that Castro is going to be gone before the election. Well, the mafia slow played it, and they didn't get him killed in time for the election to help Nixon, because they decided to go with Giancana and support JFK. JFK gets in. He doesn't follow through on his promises that his daddy made to Giancana. That makes Giancana look bad. It makes Kennedy look bad. And so now they have to go to plan B. And plan B is, we'll still try to assassinate Castro, but then he closes down the camps. He arrests E. Howard Hunt. He arrests Frank Sturgis. And he starts saying, now they realize it's going to be impossible to do that. So the new problem becomes Kennedy. And I think that's what's important here, is to see the line, the progression here, where first Castro is the problem, and then eventually Kennedy becomes the problem. And the way that the operation was put together smacks of a false flag, because the entire thing has to be blamed on somebody to justify an invasion, which is really what they want. And so they set up this dupe Oswald. They smear him with all these pro-Castro ties and Cuba ties. And that's the news that comes out after the assassination. And all the attention is focused on Castro and Cuba. And of course, then when Blakey comes out with his report, there's a lot of questions about why he pinned everything on the mob like he did. He was, the House Select Committee was prepared to come out with a report that basically doubled down on the Warren report. The only thing that changed that the last minute was those dicta belt recordings in Dallas from that motorcycle cop. When those dicta belt recordings came out, they had to go and study those. And when the report from the company came back, said there were sounds that made it sound like there were 11 shots, but we'll only swear to 4. Well, 4 is more than 3. 3 is what the Warren Commission said one shooter could do. So 4 means at least 2 shooters. And of course, the company said it came from 2 locations, one of them from the grassy knoll. So now they know there's 2 shooters from 2 locations, hence a conspiracy. but we don't want to delve into it any deeper. We don't want to pin this on any government agency. So they're very careful to absolve the CIA. They're very careful to absolve the FBI, and they pin it all on Marcello. They pin it all on Trafficante. They pin it all on the mob. I think it was a cop out. They didn't finish the job.
When Castro saw that Kennedy, or received the news that Kennedy was assassinated, there was a liaison there, a speaker of peace that was there to meet Castro. And he said, looks like your peace trip is over with, after he got the news of Kennedy's death. And he says, I bet you that they're going to blame this on a one lone assassin aspect. And I think that was because Castro knew about all these attempts. I mean, people think Kennedy knew about all the assassination attempts on Castro. He didn't. I mean, even when we got the paper on Operation Northwoods, he thought it was fucking insane because they were talking about shooting up, like nobody knows this stuff, but people were talking about shooting up schools. People were talking about blowing up one of the spacecraft vehicles and blaming it on Cuba. They were going to shoot down an airliner and blame it on Cubans. There's a bunch of weird plans that were passed along to Kennedy. Now, whether you were going to say that they were going to implement those plans or not, or it was just to see if Kennedy would play ball. My thing is, if you ever listen to Kennedy in his debates versus Richard Nixon, he said a lot of amazing stuff that today would be like, oh, he's talking about peace and he's talking about a lot of things about the economy and civil rights and a bunch of stuff. Well, it made me think, why is the mob helping Kennedy win then? Wouldn't the mob want to be involved in Cuba? They want to get their territory back, unless they already made negotiations with Castro, maybe keeping the military out. Nixon was 100% for going into Cuba and going into other aspects of things. So I thought Nixon would be their best choice. But this is where I bring in the government aspect. Nixon knew a lot of this stuff. He knew a lot about the mob connection that Kennedy didn't know until he found out later. He knew a lot of individual stuff about the government where they basically, I've seen documents label Nixon as an intelligence risk. A lot of power. Now, if you know anything about the blackmailing aspects of having all this information, look at Hoover. Hoover knew so much on everybody. They talked about, oh, Hoover was never into blackmail. He had files on people's like personal lives, their meeting, their hangouts. Frank Sinatra, because of a connection with Kennedy, he was holding over Kennedy's head. And I just get into this area of like, that's a lot of power, whether you want to use it for blackmail or not. But I have documents that state they were blackmailing jurors on the Watergate trial as well, too. And Jeff Shepard was on the show talking about the perjury in those trials. Now, I'm not a Nixon fanboy, but I'm in this aspect of saying, I think everybody's kind of pointing swords at each other and trying to get across, which makes me wonder if the mob did have this connection with Kennedy. Is it because this aspect where people say he experienced real change, where he just went from this platform of running as a Cold Warrior to this man that didn't want any nuclear war at all? And I start to think maybe the mob found out later about this change and started noticing he wasn't following through with a lot of the promises. And now that caused them to get angry and seen as a slight. Because I think with the mob, you have to look at, like, you're having them testify in court over things. They're going to look like a fucking rat when it's, posted in newspapers, and they don't want to be associated in that aspect of things. So a lot of this is like multiple hands of many different snakeheads that are involved in this thing. And that's what's hard, is that they somehow got all these under one umbrella, which is like the worst combination ever, because it might have worked. It might have been good for the CIA for a while, but eventually it became a problem with the number of people that were doing their own actions and going kind of rogue, in a sense, where we talk about the rogue elements of the CIA. I'm not taking the government out of this. I'm just looking at them as more of a chess player rather than a chess piece. And the mob characters are starting to be kind of the chess pieces. Kennedy's a chess piece. Richard Nixon's a chess piece. I mean, I can show you this, which I thought this was very, very interesting. This came out of Harold Weisberg's archives. And if you know who Harold Weisberg is, he was a reporter at the time. He did a lot of great things when it comes to just Kennedy research in general. But this is from Sue J. Lee Rankin from Charles M. Schnaffer. He says, I have this date been informed that Richard M. Nixon was in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, the day before the assassination of our late president, in connection with a speaking engagement before Bottlers Convention. And while in Dallas, was registered at a hotel under a fictitious name. This information, while interesting, really has no relevancy to the commission's inquiries. Its importance seems to be in the same type saving information which is available to you. Ruby gained entry into Dallas police station. They said that he didn't know any Dallas police officers, but there's someone that accounted for seeing him go in there. We have connections that obviously there's many mafia interviews that talked about seeing Ruby have connections with Dallas police. Tippit also, apparently by the Silver Spur, they talked about seeing Tippit would patrol around there often. I'm just getting into this point of we have Nixon. There's 3 presidents in Dallas when Kennedy's killed. The first time ever that's ever happened. There's Johnson, or future presidents, I say Johnson, Nixon, and then you had Kennedy. Now, Nixon said he was at a bottling convention. I don't really believe that because he's under a hotel under a fictitious name. So I'm getting into this aspect. Did he want to see if something was going to happen? Was he waiting for a plan to get through? I mean, he was very scared during the Watergate thing that something was going to happen. And I talked to Jeff Shepard about what was on that 18 minutes of missing tape. I asked him 3 times about the Kennedy assassination. He did not answer me all 3 times.
I know, I heard it.
So I'm in this boat now where I see Nixon, his involvement. I get the whole angle now, but I'm trying to figure out what was Nixon planning on doing with the mob? What was he planning on doing with these elements of the government that were, kind of doing their own thing? I mean, a little bit of a deeper state talk, I would say. I mean, it gets all into really hard territory when you're.
Well, you got to understand that Nixon's roots were in the 5412 committee, and how he got things done was through covert action. And as long as he could tie it back to communism, this covert action was green lighted by the CIA. It was a subcommittee. So, and then at some point he started getting in, I think he started off with operations that he could justify, but at some point, that power, they say power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And he began to see the potential. He could use this on anybody or anything, but you're going to have to come up with a more covert way. I mean, he had his covert operations, but when he went to this S-Force level, he went even more covert. And he went off the books completely with civilians, using Howard Hughes and Robert Mayhew, and then they recruited mob hitmen to do this. And so, I look at Nixon, LBJ, and Kennedy all being in the same place at the same time. I ask the question, when does coincidence end and conspiracy begin? Because first of all, it's the Secret Service would never allow the president and the vice president to be together in the same motorcade. It had never been done before, and it's never been done since.
Same thing.
There's only one time it's ever happened.
Same thing with printing the newspaper or the route in a newspaper 3 days before the assassination attempt.
Right. And then changing that route at the last minute to bring it to include a 90-degree turn and a 120-degree turn, which slows the motorcade down almost to a stop right in front of a tall office building. If you really want to get into Secret Service problems, the Secret Service, some people say they made a mess of the whole thing. No, they didn't. They did exactly what they intended to do, which was to remove the protection from around the president for a period of time to allow this to take place. And Nixon, I was talking to my class the other day and we were discussing this, and we went through all the lead up to 63 and how Nixon was terrified in 72 when the Watergate stuff happened, that his involvement would be discovered because it was his S-Force. He knew who did it. He was in Dallas. He knew who was there as well. And he knew who did it. And when the Watergate thing busted open, it was all the same names of all the same S-Force that he had put together. And then E. Howard Hunt, one of his guys, said on his deathbed that LBJ was the one who signed off on the plot. So you got the guy at the beginning, Nixon, whose S-Force committed the assassination, and you have the guy on the end, LBJ, who's going to be the next president, who ties everything off, right? The 2 succeeding presidents after JFK, LBJ and Nixon, were both involved in this. According to E. Howard Hunt, LBJ signed off on the plot because somebody had to be powerful enough to appoint a Warren Commission to basically tie off the investigation in Texas. There was no politician more powerful in the state of Texas than LBJ. That's why it happened there. So you see the fact that they are all 3 there, and LBJ's in the motorcade, and some of the odd things that happened on the plane after the assassination while they're waiting to take off. It's very clear to me that that story about the S Force that Santos Trafficante tells. And you got to understand, Santos Trafficante was putting himself at risk to tell that story. He just never thought the story would get out because he was telling his own attorney, but it did get out. And so, you're talking about a mafia don who wasn't just upset that JFK had double crossed the mafia. He was upset about that, but he was also upset that Sam Giancana had put the mob at risk by making that deal to begin with. And so it's not a big mystery what happens to Sam Giancana the day before he's supposed to testify at the church committee. They find him in his kitchen, with 7 bullets to his mouth. And it's no big mystery what happens to Johnny Rosselli right after he is supposed to testify again for the second time to the church committee. They find him, as you said, uh, his body dismembered down in a bay down in Miami. And he had already sort of spilled the beans. He had already told the House Select Committee or the church committee the year before, and when they were going to call him back the second time, he was going to expand on it. He said basically, hey, the assassination was a team that had been put together years before by Richard Nixon. It turned because of events that had happened, and it chose as its target Kennedy instead. And that's what happened. And I think sometimes we can get lost in all the angles of it. But I agree with you. I think the CIA was the chess, sort of the guy that was moving the chess pieces around. But that means that they're the ones that are in charge of the conspiracy, and the other ones are just dupes. They're soldiers. The mafia were soldiers. The Cubans were soldiers. They were motivated.
Yeah. Could I toss 2 angles out at you? One, Trafficante wrapping up Roselli and Giancana. I think we stated that earlier. I think you said you fall in line with that as well too. But I want to toss another one. Is it possible the CIA could have killed both of them and then made it look like it was Trafficante's problem?
I think the CIA had a relationship with Trafficante to such a degree that all they had to do was basically drop a hint. This needs to be taken care of. This is a loose end.
I'm not going to show a whole bunch more documents, but I just wanted to show this one here. It says the committee considers it's probable that Trafficante approved and assisted in the murder of Johnny Rosselli. Trafficante's motivations could have been to maintain a low profile in connection with the CIA plots and to prevent disclosure of other known or unknown persons involved in the plots, as well as to other operations and activities which an investigation of the plots might uncover. The committee does not believe such activities were necessarily connected to the assassination of President Kennedy. For instance, Trafficante may have had a covert relationship with Castro, which may have emailed or entailed his running contraband through Cuba and the United States. Now, that's suspicious to me only because it says when Keynes plans to visit Cuba, either to install wiretaps for former President Prio or to take photographs of rebel activity, or both are considered simultaneously with Giancana's presence in Miami and his reference to the assassination of Castro in November. And with Keynes' approach to the CIA, the true purpose and possible interrelation of these events become more suspect. The wiretap assignment and the photograph story may have been covers. Giancana may have been attempting to send Kane to Cuba to supervise the poisoning attempt on Castro. Kane belonged to La Cosa Nostra, spoke Spanish, and had extensive contacts in Latin America, well versed in sabotage and investigative procedures, and had been on Giancana's payroll for years. So I know they had an inside man with Castro that guy eventually lost. Is why the poison pills were never delivered. But I'm starting to wonder if a way that they could, because you had to think the CIA or whoever was probably keeping tabs on Giancana, Trafficante, Roselli, Harvey, a bunch of these individuals that are performing multiple different assassination attempts on Castro. Their probably reaction would have been, let me inform someone who's on the inside with Castro and just tell them what I actually want done because they're monitoring me. And that's where you have someone that could have been warning Castro on these multiple assassination attempts. You have a guy supervising a poison pill thing. In my kind of response and just I think basic of just looking at if you're going to be involved in assassination attempts, you don't want to be there when the fucking plan unfolds, or you could just go up there and shoot Castro in the head and then get killed yourself. That's a suicide mission to sit there and wait for pills to be delivered. And then, I mean, if you're a new guy in on Castro's force, he doesn't know you, he doesn't trust you. You're friends with Giancana, but you're monitoring pills being delivered or poison being administered. You want to get out of that area because they're going to suspect you first, right? I mean, that's not stupid to say, but there's a lot of weird inconsistencies where I'm starting to wonder. It's like the mob seemed like they knew how to deal with the government. in a way that they knew that they were being surveilled. So the best way to get all the real shit done was give it to some people that they knew that they weren't going to follow. And those were people that might have been close and might have had an in to help perform some of these assassination attempts. When I don't know if they could have been secret meetings. I mean, that's a little bit more skeptical, I would say, but there's just a lot of weird things that aren't adding up. I mean, Trafficante killing both Giancana and Roselli kind of makes sense, but at the same time, could it have been the government and Roselli or Trafficante just could have had a deal or something like that to get it over with?
Well, I think it's real. I don't think it is as complicated as you're making it sound. I
I'm getting
think
a headache.
I honestly, I think Trafficante had to get rid of loose ends, and Giancana was scheduled to testify. And he had already demonstrated that he was willing to talk.
Well, why didn't
Uh,
they take Frank Sturgis out? Because I have a document from Frank Sturgis. It's a handwritten notes to whoever he's contacting. It doesn't say. It's redacted the name out, but he's talking about they called me a fucking liar. They made me look like an idiot. They made me look like a, and he's like so pissed off. He's like, I'm just gonna spoil all their shit. And he's literally writing down Ruby. I mean, that's where I found out I have a document to show Oswald in Cuba. I have never heard of that before. People say
oh
that's a
yeah, he was a
conspiracy.
yeah.
But then there's documents on Ruby as well too, and his with drugs and with gun running, with a bunch of stuff. So he's accurate in the Ruby aspect that I know of. The Oswald thing, if he was in Cuba, well, that he's accurate in that then. So they just pissed him off. But if you look up Frank Sturgis, people say you can't trust his testimony. I go, well, what did he
Yeah,
have to
well,
lose?
no, that's an interesting point because the FBI was surveilling Santos Trafficante throughout a lot of these periods of time that we're talking about. And right after the deaths, and I say deaths plural, of first Sam Giancana and then later, a year later, Johnny Rosselli, he was overheard on a wiretap saying, now there's only two people left who know about the assassination and they aren't talking. Now, the speculation is, who are those two people? Obviously him. Who's the other? And I would propose it is Frank Sturgis. You brought up his name. Why didn't he kill Frank Sturgis? Well, Frank Sturgis was never going to, here's a guy who's connected to everybody. Frank Sturgis was connected to Castro. He was connected to the Santos Trafficante. He was connected to the S4. He's connected to the CIA. In fact, he's a self-described CIA assassin. He's connected to everybody. Frank Sturgis knows how the game is played. First of all, he was so screwed up in his testimony anyway. Anything he said could have been discredited later because he contradicts himself all over the place. You sent me a document yesterday and I was reading it, and it's interesting, his story about Marita Lorenz. You remember the story of Marita Lorenz and how she said that she was a spy for the CIA and she worked with the plot to kill Kennedy. She went with Frank Sturgis on a trip from Miami to Dallas the day before the assassination. They had weapons in the trunk, and she tells that whole fantastic story. And Frank Sturgis, somebody in the document, makes him aware of what she said, and he's like, "Oh, she's crazy. She's off her. Make her go under oath and say that under oath." Well, Marita Lorenz did tell that story under oath. She's the only witness who has told her story under oath. In that Liberty Lobby lawsuit, she told that same story, and the jury believed her. The jury found for the Liberty Lobby newspaper that had accused E. Howard Hunt being involved with the CIA with the assassination. So in other words, Frank Sturgis has never been under oath and says a lot of different stories, but Marita Lorenz has been under oath and told one story, and her story was believed. And it implicates Sturgis, which is why he denies it. It implicates E. Howard Hunt. Sturgis said Marita Lorenz didn't even know E. Howard Hunt. Well, according to Marita Lorenz, she not only knew him, she worked with him and with Sturgis and witnessed all of them getting paid cash money for their jobs they did for the CIA. So I just think you go to what Santos Trafficante said on that wiretap. He said there's only two people who know about the assassination, and neither one of them are talking. And even if Frank Sturgis was going to talk, and I don't think he would, because I think he knew exactly what would happen to him. In fact, in that document you sent me, he makes mention several times of ending his life, ending the way all these other people's life have ended. So he's very aware of what happens to people who talk. And Santos, if you want to kind of find out or figure out who is the guy that's carrying out all these hits on behalf of the CIA, which I believe is what he's doing, you got to look at who lived the longest, who outlived everybody. Who's Santos Trafficante? He played both sides beautifully. He carried out the hits that needed to be carried out for this master, and then for that master, he figured out how to play both sides. But that's what the mafia does. They play both sides. That's why when they got played by the Kennedys, they were furious, because they're not supposed to be played. They're the ones doing the playing. And so when they got double crossed, there was hell to pay. And not just for the Kennedys, the politicians, it was also for the people who, in their view, got duped by the politicians, which is Giancana. And of course, Rosselli was in on the beginning of this whole thing. He was the guy putting people together, bringing the mob and the CIA and the Cubans, bringing them all together, getting them at the same table. He knew everything. And as long as he kept his mouth shut, he was allowed to live. He didn't die till 67, but he started to get or 70, it was 75, it was 75. So he didn't die for like another decade. So he kept his mouth shut for a period of time, but when the church committee came after him, he talked. And then when they wanted to bring him back and talk some more, they didn't let him. Santos Trafficante took care of him. And that was basically something that came about as a result of him being a loose end. And, you want to throw another one into that mix. How about Jimmy Hoffa? Jimmy Hoffa knew a lot going all the way back. And he became a loose end at some point because he wanted to be back in charge of the Teamsters. And Nixon had pardoned him and let him out, and with the condition that he not be in charge of the Teamsters anymore, but he wanted to be back in charge, and he was willing to trade or leverage what he knew in exchange for what he wanted. And you don't do that to the mob. You don't do that to Santos Trafficante. So they took him out as well. So you just look at who lasted the longest, who outlived everybody. And I think that's a real clue as to who was involved in this from the get-go, and who was used by the CIA first as a button man and then later as a cleanup man. And you're mentioning Ruby. He was mixed up in all this, and he was a cleanup man. But then they disposed of him. When did they dispose of him? When he got a new trial. What were the terms of the new trial? The judge said, this time you have to talk. You didn't talk the first time. Ruby's been sitting in jail. He's willing to talk now. 28 days later, he's dead of cancer. So, there's a pattern.
We gotta go into. Do you have enough time to talk about that a little bit? Because we got to talk about this whole. I have his testimony and I have the reactions with Joyan West. But when you read something like "they gave me cancer," which is what he stated, people consider that a conspiracy. But if you look at Ohio Penitentiary, there was an article about injecting into a Jewish hospital a bunch of people with live cancer cells. And it's not a conspiracy. The CIA also worked with cancer cells and trying to develop a way to give people cancers. They had heart attack medications of this sort. So there's prior evidence to it before. Whether he was injected, the strange line you can draw on the other side of that, he was injected with something. The official statement is a flu shot. But the other psychiatrist that viewed Ruby before Joyan West, who worked with MK Ultra and was a part of Ohio University, which is also a same penitentiary where they were doing live cancer cell injections as well too. Joyan West worked for the MK Ultra project, could have injected him with LSD. He has horrible hallucinations in his reports. He slammed his head against the wall, broke his reading glasses. I didn't even know he had reading glasses, but a bunch of stuff starts happening. So you get into this aspect of it's either they injected him with LSD or they injected him with cancer. One of those two, but how do you explain the 126 x-rays they gave him in a matter of 2 weeks where immediately his health declines to an all-time portion and dies of cancer? I mean, we can't predict the way that cancer speeds up, but I think we all know that radiation, especially with 1960 something radiology equipment, there's a whole chunk of history we're missing, which is just shoe salesmen back in the 60s and 50s, because the way they used to measure your foot was with a radiation x-ray thing, and all those people died of cancer. That's a whole chunk of history that we're missing because we didn't know about radiation exposure. So it's not crazy to think that they did something to this man.
Ed Haslam's written a real good book about it called Dr. Mary's Monkey. And then, of course, Judith Vary Baker has written a book about it as well. And this was a project, a CIA project in the summer of '63 in New Orleans. And of course, Oswald was involved in it. And basically, it comes around as a result of the polio vaccine back in the 50s, which Dr. Bernice Eddy, the government researcher, had looked at and said, don't. This was the second version. The first one was the Salk vaccine, the shot. They had to pull that because it killed a bunch of kids. It was too strong. It went right into the bloodstream. So they come up, Dr. Albert Sabin comes up with a second version. This one's the sugar cube. And you put it on your tongue and it dissolves into the bloodstream. It's a lighter dose. And it did cure polio. But Dr. Bernice Eddy in their tests realized that it also had two viruses in it. And SV40 stands for it's cancer, simian virus number 40, and SIV, which is simian immunodeficiency virus. We didn't really know what simian immunodeficiency virus was, but everybody knew what cancer was. And so Dr. Bernice Eddy said, don't put this vaccine out into public consumption till we figure out how to get rid of this SV40. Now you say, well, where did monkey virus? Well, the vaccine was manufactured with live monkey kidneys. So whatever viruses are in the monkeys are going to be in the vaccine. So anyway,
you got to clarify again what vaccine that is, just so YouTube doesn't flag it for me.
It was polio.
Okay.
It was polio. Yeah. And so anyway, Nixon was the vice president at the time. He had been assigned by Eisenhower to get this vaccine into production as quickly as possible. People were panicked about polio. It was affecting mostly their kids. You can understand the outcry for sure. And the first vaccine had been promised to be safe. It wasn't. They pull it. Now they got the second one. They don't want to pull it too because they're afraid people will stop trusting the NIH and the CDC, et cetera. So they go ahead and put it out anyway, despite Bernice Eddy's objections. And their thinking was, well, it's got a 30-year incubation period. So we got 30 years to find a cure for cancer. And so about 2 million Americans, I know my parents took it, the
sugar cube.
The sugar cube, you put it on your tongue, it dissolves, and it did cure polio. But 30 years later, we have this massive cancer outbreak in the 80s, and then AIDS. Simian immunodeficiency virus becomes human immunodeficiency virus, which turns into AIDS. We didn't solve cancer in the 30 years. We didn't solve AIDS in the 30 years. Well, before all the 80s happens, in the 60s, the CIA says, there's potential in this vaccine that has cancer in it. What if we could speed it up? What if we could weaponize it so that it would actually, we put it in somebody's food, we inject them with it, we put it on the end of a dart and shoot it with a dart gun, a cancer gun. The only reason we find out about this is because in the church hearings, they actually produced, there's a famous picture of Frank Church holding up in front of the cameras, a CIA manufactured dart gun, which they would shoot this dart with the weaponized virus on the dart. The dart would actually decompose when it hit whatever it hit, and you would feel like you got bit by a mosquito. But actually, what had happened was you'd just been hit with this dart, and I don't know if they actually used it or not, but they were testing it. Anyway, long story short, in '63, the summer of '63, they'd spread this program out all over across the country, and one of them was down in New Orleans. And so they're testing this virus, and what they would do, going to your point about radiation, they would shoot they would inject the mice with this vaccine, and then they would watch them as tumors grew, these cancerous tumors grew in these mice. Then they would cut off the tumors and macerate the tumors in a blender and create this potion that they called cancer soup, and then they would shoot it with radiation and make it more lethal. Then they would inject the next round of mice with this more lethal potion and watch the tumors grow bigger and faster until they were killing the mice in 28 days. Then they would move on to marmoset monkeys, and then larger monkeys and larger monkeys, and eventually humans. And at the end of summer of 63, they had perfected this weaponized cancer bioweapon, basically, so it would kill a human being in 28 days. Now, we know about this because of what Ed Haslam wrote, what Judith Very was part of the testing protocol. She was the one injecting the mice, cutting off the tumors, macerating the tumors, and then doing it again and doing it again and doing it again. And then she was involved in human tests, and so she verified the fact that it did kill a human being. They took 3 prisoners of Angola State Prison off death row. They took them down to Jackson. If you remember that story about Lee Harvey Oswald being cited in Clinton, Louisiana, and at the end of the summer of 63, that's why he was there. He was there with Clay Shaw and David Ferry, and they were going to meet those prisoners to conduct those tests. And they stopped off in Clinton, Louisiana first to establish an alibi. He jumped in line, voting registration, whatever. But he was on his way to the mental hospital there outside Jackson to meet those prisoners and do the tests. And so Jack Ruby in that summer of 63 had come to to New Orleans from Dallas to buy some showgirls from Carlos Marcello. And while he was there, he came to the labs and saw what they were doing. In fact, according to Judith Very, she explained everything. He was asking questions, and she's explaining, okay, this is what we're doing. We're injecting and we're testing and we're going to macerate and we're going to shoot it with radiation. She explained the whole thing to him so that when he gets arrested after killing Oswald and he begs the Warren Commission, take me to Washington. I'll testify. I'll tell you whatever you want to know. They're going to try to kill me here. I'm not safe here. And he said something about being injected with cancer. And they thought he was crazy. And it's been used against Ruby to prove that he's nuts. But the reason he's saying that is because he knows very well what they've been working on. And sure enough, when he gets his new trial, he'd never been diagnosed with cancer before. All of a sudden he gets sick. They take him and they diagnose him with cancer. They load him up, they subject him to all these x-rays. That was the activator. The x-ray was the activator. You get injected with this, you don't feel good, you feel sick. So you have a medical workup, and in the medical workup, they x-ray you. And the x-ray, which is radiation, is the activator, which causes the cancer to spread. And 28 days after he was diagnosed, he died. So yeah, and this is a real thing that has been poo-pooed as a conspiracy theory, but it's there's how do you explain the 28 days, and how do you explain what Judith Very said, independent of Jack Ruby and independent of Ed Haslam? They all come together with the same facts, which is this program was designed on the heels of a vaccine that had some viruses in it that the CIA thought they could weaponize into a bioweapon, and they sold it as a way to get to Castro. They decided not to use it against Castro, and you wonder if it's part of the termination with extreme prejudice program that we found out during the church hearings, which was a CIA program to kill people and leave their bodies covered with a residue that looks like, make their death look like they died of some sort of natural causes, or to kill them in such a way that there's no way that you can discover the cause. Their body is left in such a terrible state. But we found out during the church hearings that this was a real program, that the CIA was experimenting with ways to assassinate and kill people and leave their bodies in such a state that any coroner or any autopsy would conclude that the person died of natural causes. Well, cancer is about as natural a cause as you can get. And so you bring that up, and I think, that's part of the summer of 63. Oswald was involved in that. He was the runner. Oswald was the guy that had been trained to handle the materials, extremely toxic, lethal material, handle the material and take it from lab to lab. They had 3 labs. They had the lab where they kept all the mice. That was David Ferry apartment number 1. They called it the mouse house. They had lab number 2 where Judith Ferry did all the injections. And they had lab number 3 where Dr. Mary Sherman used the radiation equipment to shoot the cancer soup with radiation and make it more lethal. And then they would bring it back to Judith Ferry, and she would re-inject the next round of mice. And the guy who did all the running back and forth and all of that was Lee Harvey Oswald. So that's why he was on that trip. He handled the material when they went to test the prisoners. And I suspect, I don't have any proof of this, but I suspect that one of the reasons why the summer of '63 cover-up was so important, when you get to the Clay Shaw trial, for example, when Jim Garrison in New Orleans was looking into what Oswald did all summer in New Orleans, he got really close to finding out the truth about that medical Manhattan Project. And one of the reasons the CIA went down and screwed that whole trial up was not just to cover up what happened with the JFK assassination and protect their assets, Clay Shaw, but also to protect what had happened in that summer of '63 medical Manhattan Project. That was, it's one thing to talk about an assassination of one man, a president, even though he's important. It's another thing to talk about the genesis of this medical Manhattan Project and scare the American people into realizing that 198 million people took a vaccine. It was tainted. And, so there was a lot of motive in different directions to cover up what Oswald was involved in that summer of '63. But Garrison was on to something. And they had to make him out to be crazy. They had to destroy him because they knew that he had a tiger by the tail. And there was more going on that summer of '63 in New Orleans. I don't really care about Dallas. Dallas is just the place, the site. That matters very little to the whole equation. What really matters in the JFK assassination and all this cover-up is New Orleans. New Orleans is where that's why the CIA put together a hit squad to get inside the Garrison district attorney's office and screw it up from within.
There's a HSCA document at one point. I mean, the HSCA committee had a bunch of safes everywhere with classic information, but there was one safe, if it was not one, it was 2, that had 2 separate combinations on it. One set of the combination went to the HSCA committee and the other set went to the CIA. Now, I have a document that I'm going to be showing in a members episode that's going to be coming up, which is that they found that one of these CIA agents, who was then fired, went into this safe, somehow got both combinations, went into this safe. And what he went through was autopsy photos. He went through a bunch of stuff where he took them out of the plastic little thing that they were in and touched them, did everything. He left a diary on a windowsill. They asked if you looked into it. He said, well, a page flipped open and I started kind of going through it a little bit. And there's that guy was fired by Breckinridge and Blakey. But then you have this aspect of okay, so now they're messing with evidence. Is this going to be contaminated now? Did they mess with any of the photos? I mean, he put them out of order. He did a bunch of things where I start going, did he take 1 or 2? They didn't know. They didn't even account what was in all the information into the safe or anything like that. But Frank Church and his committee did a lot to expose a lot of government corruption. So did the Pike Committee. But what gets called a scandal is that cancer thing. And also there's a scandal out there called the Franklin scandal. And if you know what that is, Nick Bryant's an activist I've been trying to get him on the show, but he interviewed some of these people. It's about, if you look it up, they call it a hoax, but he's interviewed people that were involved with it. He's wrote 5 books on it. He's an activist attorney and everything like that. So, I mean, he's got some credibility to him, but it was John DeCamp exposed it, who worked under Frank Church. Now, with this whole entire thing that he exposed was CIA pedophilia that was going on. And it's a massive amount. And it's only been in articles and newspapers like that. But it's got so much evidence to it, but it still gets labeled as a hoax, where I go, you have witnesses that came out. I mean, Epstein would have been a hoax if we didn't have all the documentation information. So you just look at it being a government official or government officials. We know about William Colby exposing a lot about the Phoenix program. We know about MK Ultra. Well, I don't know why this one's so hard to, I guess, understand, but people will label it as a conspiracy. I just don't think is right.
Blakey with the House Select Committee has since, subsequently realized that he got bamboozled, and it was by the CIA. The very guy, and I don't remember his name. I wish I could remember his name, but the very guy that the CIA basically loaned to the House Select Committee to be the liaison and to look at things and determine if things should be classified or not, to sort of steer the Blakey Commission from the CIA perspective. Turned out they swore he was an unaffiliated, unconnected guy to any of these operations. They found out in the years subsequent that he was involved in Operation Mongoose down at JM Wave in Miami. In other words, this guy was as conflicted and as deep into this as anybody could be. He knew where all the bodies were buried, and he knew what direction to push and what information to manipulate. And Blakey is on record as stating that he will never trust the CIA again. And the CIA, if you think about it, FBI too, is in the process of they're in the business of disinformation. That's what they do. They lie. They don't tell you the truth. They don't tell you the whole story. Their whole modus operandi is deception. That's what they are. They're spies. So to rely on the CIA for any kind of evidentiary process, whether it be the Warren Commission or the House Select Committee, to involve the CIA in that is foolhardy to me, because you are dealing with people who lie for a living, and they are going to lie in one direction. They're going to lie to save themselves. It's the same thing with Hoover. When the Warren Commission investigated, and I use that term loosely, they didn't do any investigation. The Warren Commission took what the CIA gave them, took what the FBI gave them, and formed a conclusion based on that. Well, Hoover didn't even believe a mafia existed.
I've seen the pictures of him in a dress. I've seen him and I showed him
He
on
was
air.
so conflicted by he was so owned and controlled by the mafia that he didn't believe. He was on record saying there is no such thing as a Cosa Nostra, blah, blah, blah. And because he was gay and they had photos of compromising photos, but he also owed all kinds of money because he lost all the time at the racetracks that they owned, and they would pay his bills. They did it so they could control him and keep the Justice Department off their backs. So now you're the Warren Commission or you're the House Select Committee, and you're getting all your information from guys like J. Edgar Hoover and the CIA. And they lie for a living. They have their own reasons for not giving you the truth. And so that's why we come up with these crazy notions that Jack Ruby was not in the mob, that Jack Ruby didn't know Lee Harvey Oswald, that, and everything gets pinned on Lee Harvey Oswald, who conveniently is dead. And how is he dead? By a guy who was mobbed up, 2 days after the event. So the whole Warren report is based on or manipulated by liars. And the American people bought it hook, line, and sinker for a long time. But what's been really, really important and what's been great for the truth coming out is that people like you and people like others that are researching this, the internet and more evidence, 60 years worth of evidence has come out. I don't think there's a serious-minded researcher out there anymore. I haven't met one that really believes the Warren report anymore, that believes that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. No one serious believes that anymore. And then the House Select Committee comes along a couple of years later and pins everything on the mafia. And yes, the mafia was involved, but that is a limited hangout position. That is, I would discourage anyone from taking that as gospel, because that is a dribbling out of the truth. The real player here is the CIA. They're moving people around like pawns. The mafia was one of their pawns. The Cubans was one of their pawns. The Secret Service was one of their pawns. The military was one of their pawns. LBJ was one of their pawns. They had a lot of pawns, and they moved them around like chess pieces. But somebody like you said earlier, is behind acting as the grand master, the puppet master, like Geppetto, pulling everybody's strings. And there's no question in my mind who that person is. It's not a person, it's a group of people. And the final, I think the final nail in the coffin for the Warren Commission, who ran it. Everybody said it was Warren. Warren barely showed up to half the meetings. He was uninvolved. His name was on it, and that's why LBJ wanted him on it, because people trusted the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The guy who ran it was Allen Dulles. You might as well call it the Dulles Commission. And Allen Dulles was former head director of the CIA.
And in charge of MK Ultra with Richard Helms.
Yes. So we put the fox in charge of the hen house. We said, hey, you robber, go investigate this bank robbery and tell us it wasn't you who did it. and it's laughable. It's completely laughable. And two operations I think are really important to note that I didn't get into the first time we talked about was Operation Mockingbird and Northwoods. Mockingbird was when the CIA decided we need to infiltrate the news organizations, because they're starting to get news about our covert ops and things that we do that we don't want the American people to have. So let's go use our leverage techniques and manipulation powers to get people that are prominent in the news and in Hollywood and in textbook companies. Let's infiltrate all of those and put our people in there and steer. We'll give classified information to people who play along with us, and they'll have all this access, and we'll control the news that way. According to the Operation Mockingbird papers, the documents, there has been no end date to that operation. It has continued to this day. Okay. And they had people like Henry Luce in their pocket, which was Time Life. They had Ben Bradley, who was in their pocket. He was Washington Post editor. They had some big shots. You were talking about Dick Billings. Dick Billings worked for Time Life, and Henry Luce was his boss. How do you think Dick Billings got on that Flying Tiger yacht that was going on that mission to go kill Castro? He got on that yacht because Henry Luce got a tip from his buddies in the CIA and Operation Mockingbird that you might want to have a reporter on that boat, because you're going to have an exclusive that will be the mother of all exclusives. And so Dick Billings was on that boat. Who got the famous cover shot of Lee Harvey Oswald backyard photo? It was Time Life. Who got the Zapruder film and hid it from the American public for 5 years until Jim Garrison subpoenaed? It was Time Life. Who was going to get the exclusive on the Flying Tiger of Castro's dead body? It was Time Life. All right. Another one was Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes owned all these movie studios out in Hollywood. And that's how they controlled information. That's how they continue to control information. How many times do you turn on CNN and see John Brennan talking? He's the former director of the CIA. Or James Clapper, the former director of the National Security Agency, or James Comey, the former director of the FBI. These are intelligence guys.
It's so nice that they're willing to share some of that information to us all.
Oh, yeah. What they do is they dribble out information. It's limited hangout. We'll tell you a little that might be a little embarrassing, but it hides the bigger picture. The other operation is Operation Northwoods. You alluded to it. This was the operation that they came to Kennedy with. It was a Joint Chiefs / CIA operation to commit acts of terrorism on American soil against American citizens. And that's when you referenced blowing up schools, blowing up airliners. They even had one, and it's in the document, that says we're going to blow up a ship in Havana Harbor and make it look like the Cubans did it, false flag, so the American people will want to go in and invade Cuba. Now, think about this for a second. In the document, they reference Remember the Maine, which is how we got into the Spanish-American War. We had an American ship parked off the coast of Cuba. It blew up. We blamed Spain for it, and the American people, we declared war the next day. And they said, that false flag worked so well, we're going to do it again. Now, that makes you ask questions. I'm a historian. I like to look back and look at the big picture, and I say, man, there seems to be a trend how we get involved in these wars. Remember the Maine. We blame it on Cuba. We blame it on Spain, so we go to war with Spain. Pearl Harbor. We knew, I know, because it's documented that we had broken the code. We knew the Japanese were coming. And the night before, we sailed out of the harbor our most important ships, the aircraft carriers, so that when they come and they bomb us the next day, they just blow up a bunch of ships that don't matter. But our aircraft carriers were saved. So I wonder, was Pearl Harbor a false flag operation that we allowed to happen so that would justify a declaration of war? Remember, the Maine has been cited by the very people who did it as a false flag operation as justification for Operation Northwoods to do it again. And it was all because we wanted to invade Cuba. So you wonder about 9/11, you wonder about Pearl Harbor, you wonder about World War I and the sinking of the Lusitania, you wonder about Spanish-American War. Every time there's a war, and then you fast forward to Vietnam. How did we get involved in Vietnam? It was because they fired on a ship off, the North Vietnamese fired on one of our ships from Saigon or somewhere from North Vietnam. And as a result, we had this declaration, we get this permission for LBJ to use force, and we fight an entire war in Vietnam on an incident that nobody knows for sure even happened. In fact, most of the evidence suggests that it didn't happen. So I say all this, Operation Mockingbird controls the information. They're the ones who say, hey, if someone comes up with an alternate theory to how JFK died, call them a conspiracy theorist, label them, okay? So they control the information. And then they do that year after year through the textbook companies. And then Operation Northwoods, let's do these terrorist attacks, blame it on somebody that we want to blame it on. Like, we want to go to war with Iraq. How do we get the American people to justify or fall for this? Well, why don't we say that they have WMDs? It was Colin Powell who went before the United Nations and held up that little vial and said, this is proof that Saddam Hussein is testing weapons of mass destruction. And when they asked him, where'd you get that? What was his answer? The CIA. The intelligence services gave this to me. And this is what we're going to base our declaration of what we'd never started a war in our history until Iraq. And it was based on the CIA say so that they had WMDs. Now, did they have WMDs? We haven't found them. We haven't found them. So I look at this as a larger trend. And I say, what is going on here that the intelligence services want us to do? Where are they leading us like sheep? They talk about mass formation psychosis, where people just fall for whatever lie that comes before them. And we overly trust in our leaders and we follow them blindly. Well, it looks like there's a pattern, and it's called war. It's called war. We want to fight the Spaniards and get some colonies. We want the Philippines. We want Guam. We want Wake Island. We want Cuba. So let's go fight the Spanish. And we got to how do we do it? Blow up a ship. Oh, that worked so well. World War I, the British are screaming for us to get in the war. The Americans don't want to join the war. What if we send a ship into harm's way and blow it up, blame it on the Germans? That got us in World War I. Now, World War II. How are we going to get involved in World War II? No one wants a repeat of World War I. The Americans are content to send supplies and money over for the British, but we don't want to get involved until Pearl Harbor. We got to let something happen so that the American people are so enraged, the patriotism bursts out of everybody, and off we go the next day, declaration of war. Vietnam, it's the boat that gets fired on, allegedly. 9/11, we want a war on terror. Okay, there's a lot of evidence that those buildings, that was a controlled demolition. You watch the way those buildings fell. I'm not saying it is, I don't know. But when you start to see the pattern, you start not to trust. You start not to trust. And that's the bigger picture of this Kennedy stuff and all the mafia stuff. When you make deals with people and it's all about money and power, and of course, there's nothing that generates more money and power than war. Almost all of this goes back to war. What happened one day after Kennedy died? His National Security Action Memo 263 turns around, becomes National Security Action 273. 263 pulls out all our troops from Vietnam. His body is still warm. And LBJ signs 273, which reverses it and sends them all back. That's what matters. That's the change in policy that they were going for. All this other stuff is window dressing to like Oliver Stone says it beautifully in his movie. He says it's to confuse the mind and to get everybody all chasing rabbit trails, and they're laughing at us the whole time we do it. It's the big picture that matters. It's war, it's money, it's power.
I'm going to get you on to record on one of these weekends when we can have, because I know you got classes going to start here in a minute. But Barry,
they're lined up at my door knocking on my window.
Barry, I appreciate the hell out of you, man, for doing my show again. Like I said, you're welcome back anytime. Sure, we're gonna I'll have to plan a panel at some point with a bunch of other people. But where can people find your books, and where can people find any other links you'd like to promote?
Just go to Standards Plus HistoryAcademy.com. Standards Plus HistoryAcademy.com. I have a lot of history content on there that I offer to people, to students, to homeschool students, to whomever, government material, JFK material, Watergate material. I also have my books on there as well. So it's Standards Plus HistoryAcademy.com.
I'm gonna link it all in, and also your Twitter. And I appreciate everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.